Hey, Reunion friends, welcome back. Dinner Church, hope you're doing well. Melinda, Dean, continuing the conversation with you around our culture statements as a network. Did I point to the wrong person?
No, we literally went like this at the same time.
It was like we are aligned.
Yeah.
So this week we're talking about our culture statements that around being peacemakers.
Mm-hmm.
That part of what it means to follow Jesus is being a peacemaker. And we define that as saying we pursue Jesus' way of peace, serving as agents of reconciliation in all things. This is a biggie. Last week, partygoers felt like uplifting, and this one is like a bit harder work to see ourselves in it. Mm-hmm. So when I was growing up, I used to love, but when I did stay home, if I was sick from school, I used to love watching daytime game shows. And my favorite game show, I think it's still running, is The Price is Right.
My favorite, Bob Barker.
Bob Barker used to be it. I think Drew Carey's the guy. And he's been doing it for years. But if you know the game show, the one thing that's so cool is they randomly call, at least it's supposed to be, I think, randomly call people named from the audience. So they'd be like, Melinda, come on down. You're the next contestant on The Price is Right. And they say, come on down. They bring them down to the front to contestants row, and their hope is to play the games and get onto the stage and ultimately try to get to the showcase showdown. Right?
Yes.
So when I read the passage for this week from 2 Corinthians 5, it's not fun like The Price is Right. But there is a sense when Jesus is inviting us, and Paul's writing to the church, inviting us to be ambassadors, to consider ourselves agents of reconciliation, ambassadors of what God is doing. He's basically saying, come on in, come on back, come on down. You have a role to play in being an agent of reconciliation, a peacemaker, which is really fundamental to what it means to follow Jesus. It's just not as fun to talk about necessarily as the partygoers. But let's jump into it.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the first thing is, on a personal note, this is a hard one. Like we were talking within, this is our culture statement, so this is in community within our Reunion network. And so when it's within community, it sounds like we can do this together. But when I look at it, my own personal responsibility, Matt, it's like, because I have to look at, am I an agent of reconciliation in all things? In my own life, in the groups that I associate with or don't, in my assumptions, in my prejudice, in my biases, in my racism, in a lot of those things. Yeah. And am I actively, as an individual, working towards peace and reconciliation with my family, with my mother, with my father, with my sister, with a colleague that I have troubles with. So I think there is that pause for me, and this is a good conversation for me because I think I'm part of a community, but coming into the community, I feel like I need to actively be an agent of peace as I am in community as well. Yep. And so I think those are big things. And I think, on a personal note, being someone who has been on the other end of bias and prejudice and racism, I understand so much more the need of the church and community to be people that are ambassadors of peace and reconciliation. Because how many of us have been on the outside and had broken relationships because of it, and definitely need a community to bring us in and extend peace and reconciliation. So that's kind of where I'm at, just my first thought as I come to this conversation.
Yeah, those are big. Even just in hearing you speak there, it shows that we often see reconciliation as like it's this work that is outward, like we have to do it in the world, and it's in some ways it is very visible, and it does require us to put ourselves out there. But I think like foundationally, and something that I have learned as someone who, really like in the whole scheme of the world, like as a middle, youngish aged white male in the country that I live in with the status that I have, like I am at the top of the privilege pile. And so sometimes when it comes to reconciliation, what is required of me is actually being just like a really astute listener and to step back and say, where have I, maybe without even knowing, like caused harm or wronged someone non-intentionally, but my role is not to like take charge, but is to step back and listen well and see, okay, how can in my listening, it's not an excuse to not act for sure, but it's like the first step is like, how do I need to show up in this space in a way that's honoring to the other, that's honoring to the people who've been marginalized by people like me, and maybe even by myself in my own actions or whatever. And so seeing that and marrying that into my spiritual discipline of trying to be still and be quiet and hear from God and from Jesus, like, what is it that's required of me to be like an agent or an ambassador of God on behalf, and like to show, like, God is here to listen, and the end goal is restoration and reconciliation in all things. But that doesn't necessarily, we want to just jump into action and be a fixer and be a doer. But sometimes that can actually cause more harm and more injury, rather than stepping back and saying, how can I be a participant by like learning and seeing my blind spots, and then stepping in a way that's more appropriate and more helpful and will actually lead to a fuller reconciliation and restoration of relationship. So that's something that I'm trying to wrestle with too.
I think I agree with that. Like that makes a lot of sense to me, because I think we often want to jump to, well, what can we do to fix it?
Yes.
We want to jump to action and to movement in that way, because we're uncomfortable sitting in the space where we have to confront our own biases and prejudice.
Right.
But we can't properly be agents of reconciliation until we recognize, like, I love that it says, Christ was reconciling the world to himself, no longer counting people's sins against them. That's us too.
Huge.
Yes.
Right?
Yes,
And
huge.
so often we don't want to start there, but until we start from our own place of recognizing the gift we have through Jesus, how can we then ever love and care for people and work to bring peace, So I appreciate that thought of, we have to find ourselves in that first, and not just say, well, what can we do then? Let's just solve it. Like, let's jump to action. And that, unfortunately, is what I've often been prone to do, is quickly want to get into action rather than, maybe I have a lot of things to learn and some self-investigation to do.
And that's encouraging for both of you to say that to me.
Yeah.
Well, and not just to me, but to as you're thinking and thoughtfully as we're having this conversation, because that's what, for someone like me, needs to hear. That you actually are intentionally choosing to listen and to learn, and not to fix it and be solution, because that's a lot of times not what's going to fix it.
Yeah.
It's actually listening and being a part of the community and inviting me into the space, and me inviting you into my space, and having conversations to agree to disagree, or to agree and to understand one another. I think that's part of reconciliation, is stopping, listening, being present, holding space for the differences, and then in love, continuing the conversation. I think that's exactly in that verse, Matt, that you read. That's one of my favorite lines, where it says, but what is it? It's that Jesus didn't hold the sins against, what was it, where he says,
no longer counting people's sins against
which
them.
I think is our issue as the church, is that we've counted sins against many people and many people groups for so long, which is broken, and why we need reconciliation, because that's what we've done. We've been known to be the people that are against versus the people that are for.
Yes.
And I think that's a really beautiful line, that he didn't count the sins against them, which is what we tend to do, which I think is why there's a lot of brokenness and fear with the church and people that follow Jesus. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, sometimes people, I think often the question is, well, how do I know? Everything's overwhelming. How do I even know where to begin? It can just shut us down. And I remember one of our professors once talking about, like, the Jewish concept of shalom. So we use the word peace, but, like, what is that? What does peace mean? Is it just the absence of war, or is it the absence of conflict? What does peace mean? And the Jewish understanding of shalom is wholeness, completeness. And so the challenge then, and the encouragement for us, is to have eyes to see wherever the wholeness or the shalom of God is broken. We are then, as agents of reconciliation, to pay attention and to consider and to pause, say, how can we help bring wholeness back to these places where the shalom is broken?
Right.
Which is maybe a better way for us to approach it, rather than the whole scope of, well, peacemakers, how do we even start any of this?
Yeah, what does that look like? And I know, like, Melinda, you've talked about how in your group, like within our church, sometimes it's asking the question, like, so what? Like, so what does this mean for me?
Yeah.
Because we can go into the depths of theology, and it's really interesting and fun, and we can be like, wow, that's so cool, and then get in our car, and it's like nothing changes, right? But one thing that I experienced that is really powerful is asking God to show you where the shalom of God is being violated in your life or in your city.
Yeah.
And so one thing that I've done in my neighborhood is, like, walk intentionally and slowly through, like, really trying to be aware and pay attention of, like, where are places or spaces that it feels like the shalom of God, the wholeness, this presence of peace is being violated? Where are the places that it doesn't feel right, or it feels like if Jesus were to show up, he would want to go there?
Right.
And it's amazing at the places that you walk by or drive by every day, that when you do so with the intention of looking for, this violation of God's shalom, that you can see it, and you can see God's heart for an area or for a people group or for something. Like just in my neighborhood, there's like a monument. It's kind of like a heritage site, and lots of people's stories are remembered there, and they've been really upgraded. Like physically, the buildings have been painted and upgraded and made nice. And there's a First Nations longhouse that is still neglected and dilapidated and behind fences and all overgrown with like prickle bushes and blackberry bushes. And I'm like, whose story has value and whose story doesn't have value in this space? And so seeing that, I felt the heartbreak of God for a community who has not experienced reconciliation, and in this site, which is like it's a government-owned site, to see our Japanese heritage is being celebrated, the Chinese heritage is being celebrated, but our indigenous community is still being like neglected physically in the structure of the place. And to say like, we need to fix that and tell that story and allow that to stand. And I mean, obviously for the indigenous communities of Canada, like reconciliation is a big effort that we all need to participate in. And sometimes it's stepping back and listening and saying, where would it be that we would be invited into?
Yeah. One of the biggest things too, I have friends who are indigenous and from different Asian cultures, and over the years we saw the rise of Asian hate and so many different things. And the biggest thing that I've heard from my girlfriends is they've said, learn our culture. Like there's an intentionality about learning, like know our history, listen to our music, watch our movies. She's like, it's not a scary thing. I think people get overwhelmed, but it's actually a first step in saying, I want to be curious. I want to know who my neighbors are, so I'm going to learn. And that was the biggest thing. Read our books, movies, music, artwork, all of that, and immerse yourself and know. And so then when you come to us, you have a better sense of who we are, and actually we're not so different as you think we are. Because that's the thing, I think a lot of times we're not intentional about being in this space. God, where are you, leading us? And so there's fear about, we don't know what we're gonna say, how we're gonna be. And the more that you get to know a people group, a person, obviously the more you realize, oh, we have the same likes and dislikes. Yeah. We long for the same things for our kids and for our future. And all of a sudden, the divide becomes way more close to where you're actually like, we're so similar. Yeah. And I do find, I will say, as someone who, has done, the work that I do has featured, a lot of diverse voices and people. That is the number one thing they say. Get to know us, be intentional, listen, and learn. And from there, together, we can come up with some solutions on how we can then move forward. But it's never about you doing it. Right. It's about us doing it. Yeah. And I think in community, like reunion together, imagine how powerful and beautiful that would be if together communities like that chose to be that in a listening posture and learning, and then seeing where God leads us to impact in our communities. I'm excited for that.
Yeah, one of the things when I think about this passage about being an ambassador that I kind of hang out in my mind for a bit, like if you're the ambassador representing a king, you're coming with like the decree, the ethos, the values of the king, and earthly kingdoms are held in place through power, military might, all these things. And the upside down way of Jesus, when he's talking about it, is like to be an agent of his kingdom is to be a peacemaker. I'm just like, like if that's what the expansion of the kingdom looks like, we know how earthly kingdoms are expanded or maintained. The kingdom of Jesus is expanded and people are invited into it through making peace, for bringing wholeness, reconciliation. Like that's what I want to be about. And yet it's so funny that in our mind I can picture quickly what military kingdom looks like. But what does peaceful reconciliation kingdom work look like? It requires more imagination.
Yeah, I love that. It's the invitation again to like creatively find how we're going to live out these kingdom values.
Right.
And I love it. Makes it more challenging, but I love that there is not a prescriptive way.
Right.
Like this is how you're. It's like it's so wide open that on one hand it can feel daunting. But then the invitation buried within that is like, you don't have to be anything other than yourself to find your way towards being an agent of reconciliation in all things.
Yes.
You're going to do that as you are uniquely made. You'll pursue it, as we say in the culture statement. Like, I love that it's active, like it's pursuing it, but that might be taking a backseat and listening. It might be taking a leadership role. It's using our strengths and our gifting to be who we're made to be, to accomplish these purposes. And I think that it's so inspiring that I don't have to be anything other than who I am to participate in this and to achieve amazing things and to bring about this kingdom that is upside down in the way of the world. And that's so compelling and interesting. It's far more interesting than like, I'm stronger than you, I have more power than you, so therefore subject to me. It's like, no, we're gonna make things differently.
Yeah.
And imagine too, just as far as when I'm thinking reunion, imagine a church community all across the world that is known for peace and not power. Like, imagine where we are known for, being ambassadors of reconciliation. It would imagine people would be so attracted to that space, the table that we provide, where it's diverse voices and people all working towards reconciliation and all working for listening and learning. I mean, that is so attractive, and I wish we were known for that. I wish more and more that I would be known for that. That it's not about power for me or being better than someone or knowing more. It's actually about listening and serving and coming alongside. And so I'm really honest, I'm encouraged by that. This one is a hard one, I think, as far as personally and in community, but I think it's one of the most important as we live this out, as we follow Jesus, in our neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Can I leave us with one mental hook?
Yeah.
So when kingdoms of the world are in conflict and they're trying to resolve conflict, we often use the phrase, they're coming to the table to have peace talks. Like, let's come to the table for negotiation or whatever. And I love about our table culture, our culture of table that we've already talked about, and about this one, is we're actually inviting people to come back to the table of healing and reconciliation, not because we're necessarily at war with each other, but because Jesus has set the table and we all find our place of equality at that table. And that to me is such a beautiful picture. But we have to know who we are to sit at the table and to understand the stories of the other people as they approach. It's not my table.
Yeah.
It's Jesus' table, and I'm just as lucky, and I need to be filled with awe and gratitude to have my space there. And all of our tables as you're meeting, we want to create safety and space to learn and to grow and to heal and to be agents of peace.
Yeah.
So how about we leave it there?
Yeah.
So much more,
good.
I know.
Yeah.
But we'll pause there. And you can continue the conversation with your group. So much to get into, and really spend some time thinking about what does it look like in your neighborhood, your city, your country, wherever you may be taking this in together with your friends. And just pray openly, as Dean said, praying with eyes to say, where has the shalom of God been broken, and how can we bring hope and healing into those spaces? So over to you. Peace to you all.